Dobro večer, dragi gledatelji, dobrodošli. Bryan Lanza, moj večerašnji gost. Gospodin Lanza bio je direktor komunikacije o tranzicijskom timu Donalda Trumpa. Dobro večer, hvala vam lijepo što ste moj gost. Bili ste jednom sa svojim kolegom demokratom, a sada ste sami i iskoristit ćemo vas kao republikanca.
Thank you very much for having me here again. It's great to be here.
A uvijek je zadovoljstvo imati vas republikance, pogotovo zato što oko Trumpa nikad nije dosadno. Pa za početak dolazite iz SAD-a, jučer prekjučer ste stigli u Hrvatsku. Kakva je zapravo situacija danas kada je riječ o Trumpovim izgledima za ponovni mandat?
Well, I would say this. President Trump is in a strong position and most likely to win the Republican nomination for presidency. And if we go into the general election, he's in a very strong position to win that as well. In fact, he is in a stronger position to win the presidency in 2023 and 2024 than he was in 2019 and 2020. It's amazing what 4 years can do.
Čitam američki tisak i vidim da ta svijest, znate, o mogućnosti Trumpova povratka u Bijelu kuću raste. Je li situacija možda u jednom dijelu medija kao sa onim slavnim Napoleonovim povratkom? Znate, odjednom je sada to retorika koja se pomalo ublažava i ozbiljno se, naravno ne svugdje, i ozbiljno se taj povratak u Bijelu kuću razmatra.
Well, listen, I would say this. The reason President Trump is so popular today, even more than what he was a couple of years ago, was because the Biden administration is just so bad. And Americans are looking for an alternative, and they have nostalgia to when the economy was running on all cylinders during the first 3 years of President Trump. You know, right now you have the American economic value significantly less than it was, 3 or 4 years ago. And so obviously, when you step back and look at the picture and you compare what the world looked like for you in 2020, 2021, and to what you look at it now, it's not very favorable for Joe Biden. You have wars happening all over the world. You have inflation that's wiped out most of the American savings. And that has a profound effect on any incumbent. And it's such an effect that people are looking for an alternative, and the first alternative pops to mind is President Trump, because those policies were so effective, not only domestically, but internationally.
Je li ta želja za sigurnošću možda razlog da i mlađa populacija, primjerice, čuju se glasovi mladih ljudi sa univerziteta i to Ivy League, koji, za razliku od, recimo, prošlih godina, eksplicite zapravo se izražavaju kao pobornici Trumpove politike, to jest, ako ne politiku, jednostavno mogućnosti da se vrati kao predsjednik.
I would say, for the last 6 years, the strong part of the Democratic voting base had been young people. And they're losing that today. And they're losing that primarily because of the wars all over the world. I think there's a view in the universities that a lot of these young people, if the status quo remains, they will be in another war. Americans don't have short-term memory, contrary to what people believe. We all remember what the Iraq War did to our American psyche, and especially did to the Americans' youth. We lost a lot of people lost limbs. And so when you look at the recent war of Iraq, a lot of young people don't want that. They don't want to be drafted into another war, and they fear that Biden is leading America into more military engagements, and the young people don't want that. They want to live their life. They want to have economic freedom. They want to have economic security. They want to raise a family, and it's very hard to raise a family with a president who's seeking military engagements all over the world.
U vrijeme Trumpova prvog mandata njegovi pojedini vanjsko-politički potezi su otprilike estradno tumačeni, posjet Koreji i odnosi sa Putinom i tako dalje. Ali zaista je činjenica da nije bilo rata. Na ovaj ili onaj način doživjeli mi tu vanjsku politiku. Kad ozbiljno sad vi, a bili ste, dakle, u tom timu tranzicijskom, bili ste blizak suradnik, kad gledate sada post festum, kako tumačite tu okolnost da je Trump izbjegao bilo kakav konflikt?
I recall reading the book, and I don't have it in front of me right now, and it talked about, what the Soviet Union thought of Ronald Reagan, and why did they engage President Reagan in the early 80s. And the book that I had read, it was former Russian KGB officials and ambassadors who said Reagan was too unpredictable. So they had gamed out what every other American politician would do and how they respond to Soviet actions. And Reagan was different. He was unpredictable. They didn't know what he was going to do. And so you fast forward to 2016, almost 20 years later, Trump is that same unpredictable person. You know, he talked about his engagement with North Korea. He talked about sending missiles to North Korea, a flame that we would never see before. But he was also the first to engage. So when I think you look at how foreign leaders hear President Trump's rhetoric, it's not that his policies are sort of keeping everybody in line. It's his unpredictability. I think what's important to remember, that everybody forgets, when the Syria engagement was happening in the U.S., how President Trump bomb, certain factories in Syria when they were advancing. Well, he killed Russian troops. There were Russian troops in those Syrian buildings. And that said to the world, and especially the international community, that, who would have thought an American killing Russian soldiers in Syria was possible? But that's the unpredictability of President Trump, and that's what sort of puts the world leaders who are looking at challenging the U.S. saying, it might not be worth it. Let me just wait 4 more years, or let me wait 8 years. So I think the unpredictability, sort of the instability of President Trump gives people a pause, because everybody knows and everybody spent a lot of money gaming out what American actions would be under these normal protocols. Trump threw away that playbook, and I think that unpredictability is what appeals to the voters in America, and it's what scares our international partners.
Sa druge strane, recimo ugledni komentatori ili urednici poput recimo Davida Halfingera, koji je urednik politike u Timesu, govori da danas treba svako ozbiljno shvatiti svoj posao i da je dobro da to svi čine, upozoravajući da je zapravo u igri sama demokracija. Je li tome tako? Bi li Trump doveo u pitanje?
Listen, I think everybody, what I've learned over the years in politics is that sort of threat to democracy, it does a good job of motivating Democratic voters, and only Democratic voters. Independent voters know that that storyline or that narrative is not accurate. Republican voters know that storyline is not accurate. But it's become a powerful rallying call within the Democratic Party is democracy's at threat, democracy's at threat. That only moves Democratic voters, and Biden should have those voters. So the very nature that Biden and his team are talking about a threat to democracy is sort of highlighting the fact of the troubles that Joe Biden is in within the Democratic Party. Because if things were going well, he wouldn't have to be going back to the campaign pitch of 2020.
Da, ali on je sklon, kažem, tom estradnom nastupu ili pristupu politici, pa na kraju krajeva pretpostavio je u kampanji imati i nekakav reality i tako dalje, ne znam hoće se to desiti ili ne. No u svakom slučaju dana je izjava biti ću diktator samo prvog dana. Misli je naravno na ono bušiti, ali spomenuo je naravno i to da će prekinuti bilo kakvu komunikaciju sa Meksikom. Jel on to misli ozbiljno? I zašto stalno govori Meksiko? Dignut ću zid, u slučaju nuklearnog rata Meksiko će biti sravnjen sa zemljom. Mislim, je li to neki running joke, ne znam, u temu ili u čemu stvari?
Yeah, listen, I think the American voters are frustrated with Mexico because a direct result of illegal immigration that has been running through Mexico for the last 20 to 25 years. President Trump tapped into that anger, tapped into their frustration, and he quickly learned in American politics that having an enemy, a unifying enemy, is good for him. And Mexico, because of how Americans view illegal immigration and the sort of invasion that's taking place in our foreign borders as an issue that is a rallying call. And so I think we hear his rhetoric. I mean, I don't know about you, but I didn't believe Mexico was going to pay for the wall. Yeah. But a wall was being developed. And what we're learning today, look at Joe Biden, with respect to this Ukraine funding, there's an immigration package involved that actually talks about a border wall between the U.S. and Mexico. And now Biden's supportive of it. 3 months ago, Biden asked for appropriation funding or moved funds to build a wall barrier between Mexico and U.S. So I think President Trump, his rhetoric sometimes gets ahead of himself, but he knows the policy that voters care about, and the policy of strict legal immigration is absolutely something that the American population care about now more than ever, especially after watching what's happening in Ukraine with what a weak border looks like.
Kad bi vas, dobro, sad na stranu to što sad zovem estradno, ili dakle ti soundbite-ovi koji zanimaju medije i onda od njih naprave veliku senzaciju. Kada bi vas sad zamolio da, evo recimo, ukratko skicirate ozbiljan Trumpov program u ovom drugom mandatu, kako bi on glasio?
Certainly tax cuts. I mean, he will revive the economy. He will tackle inflation. I think if you look at the things that he did really well in this first term, were the tax cuts, were the deregulation policies that sort of opened up American business to expand their wings and move forward. So one of the very first things he's going to do, and it actually doesn't require congressional action, is target the regulations that have sort of stifled American businesses. You know, Joe Biden, there's been a study by the Rand Corporation that Joe Biden's policies, his regulatory policies outside of Congress, have added a 40% cost to businesses all over the U.S. That's gone within the first month of President Trump's term. So from your business perspective, where you're absorbing, you know, these government regulation costs that is an additional 40% to your business, you're now going to have 40% more cash to invest in your employees, to invest in research and development, to invest in all expansion. So I think from day one, what you're going to see is an institute to those same economic policies that led to, quite frankly, one of the strongest economies in world history.
Je se izgubio negdje onaj motiv uništit ću politički establishment Washingtona ili mu to sad više nije toliko važno ili kako s tim? To je, dakle, u prvoj kampanji bio gotovo ratni poklič.
Yeah, listen, I think we're still focused on draining the swamp. Some people say we're trying to repopulate the swamp. But I think what's important to understand, you know, when President Trump says the swamp, you know, he's talking about D.C., the dysfunction there. Nobody in America thinks Washington, D.C. is operating. They're looking for people to blame, whether it's politicians, whether it's lobbyists, or whether it's bankers. Everybody firmly believes that Washington, D.C. is broken. So drain the swamp is sort of this lineage, this verbiage that touches everything that's broken in Washington, D.C., not just the lobbyists who pollute the system.
Kažete mi, kad smo kod tog establishmenta i onih koji mu ne žele dobro, hoće li, ili još pravilnije, može li, i vremenski čak, Trump biti osuđen prije izbora?
Well, he's already been indicted. I think the question becomes, does he get convicted before the election? But I think that's a big question mark. You know, he had 4 legal cases that he was supposed to deal with next year in 2024, and now it looks like 3 of those cases are going to be punted to the following year, 2025, and the one remaining is the one that's scheduled to be in March, and that's actually before the Supreme Court right now, whether they can go forward and prosecute. So there's going to be a strong probability that there's going to be no trials next year, and that if Trump gets reelected, these charges are just going to disappear.
Kada bi se dogodilo slučajno da bude osuđen, može li prema zakonima SAD-a, da to objasnimo za hrvatska publika, možda to manje zna, Trump biti izabran za predsjednika iz zatvora? Naime, ne bi to bilo prvi puta da neko iz prije gotovo stoljeća, stanoviti Eugene V. Debs je dobio oko 1 milijun glasova. Ima i drugih primjera, ali ovo je jedan od najmarkantnijih. Bi li mogao, dakle, Trump iz zatvora postati predsjednik? Vidim da se smijete.
Listen, President Trump, you know, the beauty about the American system is we have an appeals process. So even in the miracle chance that Trump is tried next year, and then the big if he's found guilty, and that's a big if, you know, he's going to have his due process that allows him to appeal. He's not going to be in jail while he's appealing. The appeals are going to be, you know, they're going to be throughout the year. So there's no circumstance whatsoever President Trump is going to be in jail before the elections. You know, now if he's found guilty, he'll appeal the process, and that appeal is going to, you know, we've seen the appeal processes take 3 to 4 years. And so he may be found guilty. I think that's a big if, and that's a big maybe. But if that were to happen, the appeal process are going to keep him out of jail at least for the next 2 to 3 years. And if he wins the presidency, you know, like I said, I think these charges just disappear.
Što vi ozbiljno mislite o karakteru tih optužbi? Jesu li one isključivo politički motivirane?
Yeah, it's pretty clear that it's
kako je to
politically
moguće?
motivated.
Znate, niko naravno nije naivan više na ovome svijetu i nemamo tu komociju biti naivni, ali moja generacija rasla uz sliku Amerike kao, znate, zaista zemlje demokracije. I čak ljudi koji su, ozbiljni ljudi koji su putovali čak recimo iz Britanije u SAD, po povratku govorili, dobro, sve je to u redu i ta tradicija britanska i tako dalje, ali kad dođeš u Ameriku to se osjeti, mislim, ipak na drugačiji način, ta demokratska tradicija. Je li moguće, naravno, na koji mi odgovori čak Romano, sad ispadaš blesav, jer mislim, na karti, progon, vještica, istrage i tako dalje. Ali je li moguće da u 21. stoljeću u SAD-u imamo montirane političke procese?
Yes, I mean look at the district attorney of New York. He, when in his charges against Trump related to his business, they actually had to change state law. Democrats had to change state law in New York for them to try to convict President Trump, or at least indict President Trump. It was unprecedented. It had never happened in American judicial history that you had changed the laws just to target one individual. And even then, the New York Attorney General, you had the former Attorney General and the former Governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, say that it's not fair and a Democrat, I might add, it's not fair what they're doing to President Trump. They're stretching the law, and that's going to have severe consequences. And that's where we are today. And so I think if you look over time, what's happened in the last couple of years, the partisan Democrats have gone to such extremes, massive extremes, to try to target President Trump. Remember, I think last time we were here, we were talking about the silliness of Russia collusion. You had 4 investigations that have now come out that shows that there's no Russian collusion whatsoever. In fact, the facts have come out that Hillary invented this Russian collusion storyline to deflect from her Russian relationships, and she continues to live that lie. Listen, politics has infected every part of our system in society today, our judicial system, our education system, and that's not good. And if you look at it every turn, the Democrats grab for power, keep moving the line to have this aggressive assertion of politics into everything. At some point, we'll break the fever. My feeling is once Trump's done serving his second term, we'll probably break that fever and we'll go back to a normal America. But the reality is President Trump is an existential threat to democratic politics, because he goes towards the union voters, which had been a significant base of the democratic politics for the last 50 years. And so they have to do something in response. And so the first approach was let's stick him with this Russian collusion title. Well, that turned out to be fake. Remember, they impeached him. They impeached him because of his call with Zelensky, because he asked President Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. Well, where are we today? Hunter Biden's been indicted because of his activities in Ukraine. So was President Trump right in 2018 when he pressed President, or in 2019 when he pressed President Zelensky to investigate the activities? I think a lot of people will say yes. I think the politics is what the politics is, but if you sort of step back and look at it, President Trump hasn't changed who he is. Our political system has changed to adapt to him in some good ways and some very bad ways.
Znate, u Hrvatskoj se, kao da je dio SAD-a, gotovo histerično svakog tjedna pojavljuju tekstovi protiv Trumpa. I čak i kod onih ljudi koji ne prate politiku baš pomno, niti im je ona profesija, niti im je na neki način pasija i tako dalje, primjetno je da su uočili taj fenomen. Očito da je nekome stalo da se po Europi širi, mislim, protutrampovsko raspoloženje. Doduše i Donald Trump se potrudio da Europljane zabrine. Pa sad dajmo red po red. Bi li on stvarno istupio iz NATO-a? Kao što se recimo vrlo često u tim tekstovima po Europi, ne mislim samo u Hrvatskoj, nego znate, u Francuskoj, Njemačkoj i tako dalje, Politico piše o takovim stvarima. Bi li on istupio iz NATO-a?
I think he wants to reform NATO. I don't know if he's committed to leaving it yet, but I think he's frustrated. And, if you look at before the current war with Russia and Ukraine, he was very critical of NATO. He was critical of the NATO allies who were not paying their fair share. I mean, 2.5% of their GDP for military support was the bare minimum. The bare minimum we'd asked. And the Germans and the French and all these countries had never even met that bare minimum for 50 years. So Trump, being this executive that he is, he comes from the business community, doesn't understand things. He's like, wait a second. If NATO is such a priority, why aren't you investing in NATO? He goes, in the business world, if it's a priority, you invest in that business.
Ali Bryan, ova situacija sa Ukrajinom je sve Europejce i Europljane, kako god hoćete, otreznila. Svi su vidjeli potrebu NATO-a, Trump više nikom ne treba objašnjavati. Mi vas štitimo, a vi iz vaših državnih budžeta ne odvajate dovoljno. Tako da mislim da to neće biti problem. Vidite da su i Finska i Švedska ušli i tako dalje.
We'll see. I mean, I would say this. I disagree with that premise whatsoever, Romano. You having countries now who are talking about rescinding their commitment to hitting that 2.5%. So if you're the Americans, if you're President Trump, and NATO is so important, why aren't you funding it? And if you're President Trump and NATO is so important, the whole point of NATO was to stop the expansion of Russia, the Soviet Union, and the Russian influence. If you're a supporter of NATO, why are you buying Russian energy? You know, that's the thing that confuses Americans, and that's the thing that confuses Trump. If we had a priority, if we had this war, if we were fearful in another country, we wouldn't be financing them, and we would be investing in our own defense. So I think we turn to, no, I would say this, Romano, because it's very important. I think we need to turn to our European partners with respect to NATO, which NATO was created to stop the expansion of Russia. I think we need to turn to them and say, how serious are your commitments? NATO is critically important for the survival of Europe, and it's critically important to the world. We just want you guys, we just want European allies to invest in it. And not only invest in it, knock off their trade with China, or knock off China, but also knock off their trade with Russia. I mean, it makes no sense to a 10-year-old in America that how, you know, if Russia is the enemy, why are we buying energy from Russia?
U tom kontekstu, misli li Donald Trump zaista, to je sad njegov izraz, da je Europska unija foe, da je oponent?
The European Union is a compliment?
Oponent, neprijatelj, ne neprijatelj, ali netko to je takmac.
That's a great question. Yeah, first of all, I don't think President
Znate da skiciram samo, Europska unija je 500 miliona stanovnika, da su ostali Englezi, to je Britanija, to je 80 miliona, da Rusija nije išla u rat 170 još, to je tržište 750 miliona sa energijom i tako dalje, daju se svakojaki geopolitički tu zaključci izvoditi.
Yeah, listen, I think the European Union is strong for Europe, and it should be. You know, I think if you're a business guy who President Trump is going to, who comes up against you, he sees the European Union as a strong business competitor. Competition is not a bad thing. Actually, competition is a healthy thing. It makes products better. It enhances innovation. Now, the problem with Europe, the challenge, at least what President Trump sees with Europe, is they're not using the European to advance innovation. They're not using European to sort of the European Union to advance the needs. They're using European Union to sort of push liberal policies that ultimately hurt Europe. I think Henry Kissinger just said it about a month ago before he died, that, you know, the European Union allowing all these refugees out of the Middle East, out of Africa, it's been too much, especially since they didn't allow integration. We have the same problem in the United States with people coming into our country and not integrating properly and not being part of society. It's a little problem, but it's a big problem here in Europe. So if you're President Trump and you see these things, you have to ask the questions. It's like, are they working for Europeans or are they working for somebody else? Because why would you allow so many refugees that can change the complete landscape of what your society looks like? Why would you allow people into your country who have zero desire to be part of your culture? And so Trump doesn't see the European Union as some type of opponent. They see it as a healthy competitor, and that's good for both sides, but he's also confused to why European Union doesn't prioritize Europe first.
Sad ću pitati nešto što je ovdje živuća tema. Naime, shvaćaju li republikanci, dakle tema koja i ovdje ima konsekvencije bez obzira što ćete vi to tamo u Americi, dakle, porazgovarati republikanci i demokrati. Shvaćaju li republikanci koju štetu bi mogla izazvati odluka uskraćivanja zapravo pomoći Ukrajini, bez obzira što Trump misli da bi mogao završiti rat za 48 sati?
I think we're going to see the end of the war sooner rather than later. I think President Trump will have no problem asking Zelensky and Putin to go to the table and end the killing. I think he has said it before. They've asked him, what do you think of the war? He says, I want the killing to stop. I can't think of a higher priority than conserving human life. And so the President Trump is right. Can he end it within 40 hours? I don't know. That's to be determined.
To je metafora. Dakle, upravo se
no, not in his mind. In his mind, he genuinely believes he's going to get them on the phone and say this is over.
Da, u njegovom umu je zapravo ta ideja da do rata ne bi ni došlo da je on bio predsjednik. Da, ali...
He's probably right.
Da, ali znate, ovdje postoji zabrinutost, pogotovo na sjeveru Europe, da bi to uskraćivanje pomoći imalo konsekvence po globalnu sigurnost. Primjerice, ko brani Putinu onda na tom primjeru da uđe u baltičke zemlje i tako dalje?
No, listen, I think that's a great question. You know, Europe has to do more. I think the U.S. is, you know, I mean, we've committed over $100 billion to helping Ukraine. I mean, that's more than what Europe has done twofold. And I think the president is supportive of Ukraine. You know, President Trump, former President Trump, is supportive of Ukraine, you know, trying to capture its territory back. I think the president acknowledged that Putin's invasion into Ukraine was unwarranted and unjustified, and that it wouldn't have happened during his term. But what do we do going forward? How much does Europe want the Americans to invest in the Ukrainian war? Is it a blank check? You know, what's the, listen, I'm an American, I'm supportive of Ukrainians, I have a great relationship with the Ukrainian administration, senior levels in the administration. I had an interest in Ukraine before this war started, but I'm still confused to what is our priority in Ukraine. President Biden has not outlined the real interest of what, to the American people, the real interest to why Ukraine matters. And we don't know why. As somebody who's supportive of Ukraine, that's been my biggest frustration with President Zelensky and President Biden, is I don't think they've done a good job articulating the significant importance, the strategic importance of Ukraine to the United States. It can't be more than, well, we need them there to, you know, because maybe it'll stop, you know, Putin from going into other countries. Listen, he's going to honor NATO. That's important. Ukraine's not part of NATO. That's another important fact. But at the end of the day, you know, how much, you know, what is the strategic priority for the United States with NATO? And how much do you guys want, how much does Europe want us to spend? I mean, we're not spending on our border. We literally have an invasion of 13,000 to 15,000 people every day crossing the border illegally. We don't have enough money. Biden has sent the military there. You know, the Republicans feeling he's not doing enough. So I think from a domestic standpoint, it's, you know, we want our border secured first before we try to help other people. And Ukraine is a bad circumstance, you know, in my view, for President Trump. I think he should be invested in restoring Ukraine, but I think Ukraine's got to do more to invest themselves. I mean, we just had you know, President Zelensky fire the defense secretary a couple months ago for corruption. What are we doing? We've been at war for 2 years, and the defense secretary of Ukraine's stealing money. I mean, what are we doing?
Da, to je nezgodno. Mada bi se mogao biti jako sarkastičan apropo korupcije i krađe novaca u Ukrajini. Ali je jadna Ukrajina, pa neću biti ni ironičan, kao li sarkastičan. Ali, imamo tu još jedno pitanje. Recimo da se rat i završi u 48 sati ili u 7 dana. Što sa Putinom? Dakle, moraju sjeti za stol Zelenski i Putin, kao što vi kažete, i možda i neki drugi ljudi. Ali kako se onda vladati prema Putinu? Kao da se ništa nije do sad dogodilo?
No, listen, I think for Putin to ever be allowed back in the international community, and I think President Trump will feel the same way, he needs to return the land to Ukraine. Crimea is a different story. I think the international community has sort of looked at Crimea in 2014 when that happened and said, so what? I think nobody can argue that that took place. But I think from the restoration of all of Ukraine independent of Crimea, I think that's the only way Putin gets allowed back into the international community. And I don't think he'll do it. I mean, I don't know President Putin. I've studied him a little bit. But I think we're probably going to have to wait till the next Russian leader that comes in to try to negotiate back or try to put pressure to get some of that land back. That's going to be the only way, because it's not going to be American soldiers.
Mogu li republikanci, prije nego što se vratimo o vanjskoj politici, pobjedili na izborima za Kongres i Bijelu kuću, pomoći prevladavanju polarizacije, da to tako kažem, da ne kažem nekog jaza između ne samo republikanaca i demokrata, nego i u američkom društvu?
I genuinely think, you know, for us to get over this fever, this partisan fever, we probably have to see the second term of Donald Trump end. Because you have Republicans who are completely dissatisfied from the 2016 election, where they fear interference took place, and I think the data supports some type of shenanigans and interference took place. And in my view, and I've seen it in politics, and I've seen it in polling, and I've seen it in focus groups, you're going to have to get to the second term of Donald Trump for this fever to break, for the Democrats to stop stretching the truth, to stop stretching the law, to stop stretching the rules to go after Trump, and you're going to have the Republicans to sort of stop, you know, equivocating to the sins that have taken place.
O tome smo i zadnji put razgovarali, pa ste me utješili kazavši da bez obzira na sve te polarizacije Amerika ipak funkcionira kad je riječ o onim presudnim problemima. Dijalog ipak postoji i tada se normalno razgovara. A recite mi, može li Nikki Haley biti, imate problema sa...
I can hear it now. I didn't hear anything a minute ago.
Može li Nikki Haley biti prijetnja Trumpovoj nominaciji?
No.
Ne?
No. The race is over. The race is over in the Republican primary. I think in about 30 days, Donald Trump's going to probably win Iowa with a 25-point lead. That momentum is going to be overwhelming. First of all, him winning by 25 points is going to be a historic victory. The most anybody's ever won the Iowa caucus on the Republican side, I think, was 10 points. He's going to triple that success. So the storyline or the narrative coming out of Iowa is Donald Trump had a record-breaking election. That momentum is going to be too much for Nikki Haley to absorb in New Hampshire. And so, because presidential politics in the United States is about momentum, I just don't see anybody stopping Donald Trump's momentum, especially after, his win in Iowa.
Vratimo se sad, rekao sam da ćemo ponovo u svijet. Kako bi Donald Trump u ovom trenutku, što mislite, reagirao na ovu situaciju u Izraelu i artikulirao svoju politiku spram Izraela i cijele te situacije?
I mean, he is a 100% an ally of Israel. He would never waver. I think you can see, he's such. Look. I would say this. President Trump, killed an assassinated is a strong word, but killed, General Soleimani out of Iran. I think that shows his commitment to Israel. He is not afraid to take on tough actors in the Middle East. He's not afraid to take on public opinion. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem, which was a very unpopular thing, even though previous presidents had made that promise and commitment before. I think if you look at the data, Israel probably not have a stronger. I can't imagine any stronger president supporting Israel than President Trump. It's the things that he has done, the financing, all these things, the Abraham Accords, they've all been done something to provide stability for Israel in the Middle East, and I think you'll see the continued commitment of that.
Ja znam da ćete mi odgovoriti da je to nemoguće i da je to potpuno hipotetsko pitanje, ali koliko republikansku stranku zabrinjava mogućnost da Biden pobjedi i u tom slučaju koliko vam je zapravo zabrinjavajuća njegova dob?
It's a problem. It's a big problem. I mean, he's not. Listen, Warren Buffett is 90 years old, but I would take stock advices from Warren Buffett because he's still capable. You can see that engagement. Biden doesn't have that. I mean, I'll give you an example. Yesterday, he had a press conference. I think we all saw it with President Zelensky. He reached out to reporters to ask questions. He didn't look the reporter in the eye and answer those questions. Do you recall what he did? He read his notes. So the reporter asked the questions. He's looking at his notes the whole time, reading it. That's not a man who has all his capacities. President Trump doesn't need notes to answer questions for reporters. He doesn't need questions set up ahead of time. And so when you look at that to me I found very telling because he's had his head down the whole time reading the answers to those questions that were being asked by reporters. That to me is not a man that has the full capacity to be the commander-in-chief of the world's greatest military.
Bili Bryan u tom trenutku u tom slučaju bila ključna uloga potpredsjednice?
I mean, if you want Kamala Harris, you can have her. We don't want her in the United States.
Kad ćete se početi smijeti.
I think the American public has made a decision that Kamala Harris was a bad vice president and her political future is quickly coming to an end.
Trump je u prvom mandatu mislio riješiti pitanje Kosova razmjenom teritorija. Europa to nije prihvatila. Bi li Trump, ili da li mislite da bi Trump danas bio spreman za neki novi Dayton?
I think he would. I mean, listen, President Trump is proud of the work that he did here with Kosovo and Serbia. You had Ambassador Rick Grenell, who was heavily engaged. I actually know the private individual who helped Rick Grenell engage that policy. It was a German businessman. And President Trump was proud of what happened here. I think Rick Grenell, his positives and the negatives, they are what they are, but he's done a good job of keeping Trump informed about what's happening in the Balkans. And so I think if you look at President Trump at this particular time, he has a strong emphasis on China where he continues to get briefed, but he's constantly getting briefed on the Balkans as well, whether it's from Rick Grenell or myself. So I think he'll be very engaged in the Balkans. I think his wife has an interest in this area, so he's forced to have an interest in this area.
S jedne strane nas stalno uvjeravaju da se nitko na zapadu ne budi i rastegne i prvo što kaže, a šta se zbilo u Hrvatskoj i Srbiji? A sa druge strane, evo vidimo, dolazite u ove krajeve, ne samo vi. Dakle, u kojoj mjeri Balkan danas Americi uopće zanimljiv i važan?
They're critical. I mean, I think if you look at the war in Ukraine between Russia, I think the Balkans become sort of the gateway to Central Europe, specifically Croatia. So I think if you look what's happening here, you know, this region is going to have energy. You know, the Americans are going to play a big role with Croatia, and the Balkans do that. So listen, the Balkans play a critical role in the geopolitical future of this world, but specifically the geopolitical future of Europe. And President Trump recognizes that. He recognizes the specialness here of Croatia. And I think that's a good thing. I think the former ambassador here, the former U.S. ambassador here, who has a great relationship with President Trump, has done to highlight that. So I think from the standpoint of, you know, the interest and how important it is, you can't have a post-Ukraine Europe or Central Europe or Southeast Europe without the Balkans and without Croatia. It's impossible.
Kina kao da se sprema 27. napasti Tajvan. Naime, Jinping je rekao zapravo da vojska bude spremna. Mislite li da je to samo poza ili postoji stvarna prijetnja?
Listen, I've dealt with China in the past. I've studied China. I know a lot that's going on there. I think the theory before, you know, President Biden came into office is that China had the plan of ultimately taking over Taiwan economically. They were doing a great job of isolating Taiwan throughout the world. You had embassies that were shutting down in Latin America. You had embassies that were shutting down in Europe, sort of isolating Taiwan. I think since Biden's come into office, you know, at least that was the policy of what the China is like. We'll take over, you know, Taiwan in 20 years through attrition and through economic means by narrowing their opportunity. But since Biden's come into office, I think President Xi sees an opportunity. So you're right. You know, in the next year, you know, President Xi has a decision to make. You know, does he try to go into Taiwan in the next year under the Biden administration? And if he doesn't, then he's going to have to wait to anything post-Trump. Now, how important is Taiwan to the United States? What made it critically important was its technology, was its semiconductor technology. One of the things that Joe Biden has done really well is invest in American semiconductor manufacturing. He's spending billions of dollars to bring back the technology back to the United States. So the value of Taiwan, as U.S. builds up its semiconductor business, becomes sort of less economic value. And that's a bad thing for Taiwan ultimately, because if there's no real economic value to that, it's hard to engage American policymakers to what, you know, China needs to do. So you almost have the acceleration of what President Xi's like, I'll wait it out, you know, a 20-year plan. It's now with the semiconductor, it's probably now a 10-year plan. So China doesn't need to attack Taiwan. They're going to ultimately, by the policies that are taken, by the isolation that they're doing, by making countries choose side, economically, Taiwan's not going to have a choice but to join China, or to join China again. That was accelerated with the CHIPS Act. Whether that's a good or a bad thing for Taiwan, the CHIPS Act was a good thing for the United States.
Tu je dakle sad i Rusija koja je Ukrajini pokazala da možda nije onakva svjetska sila kako smo mislili, ali svakako to Rusija, Kina, Indija, koja će još snažiti dakle svoju poziciju u svijetu. I mi ovdje govorimo uvijek o multipolarnom svijetu, no recite mi kako vi, pogotovo republikanci, vidite taj svijet. Je li vi još uvijek doživljavate SAD kao onu dominantnu svjetsku silu ili je i za vas taj svijet postao multipolaran svijet?
Listen, I think economically you have to view the United States as the top of the food chain. I think if you look at projections, China may overtake the U.S. economy in the next couple of years for a small amount of time, 2 to 3 years, but then the United States sort of restores its economic might after that. You know, India's not there. If you look at militarily, nobody competes with the U.S. yet. So I think that Russia, those countries, they have a challenge. They found a space where they can operate independently of the American, the capitalist system, the world capitalist system. But that more is a direct result of the sanctions policies that that forced Iran to figure out how to bypass the sanctions systems, and Iran has now taught the Russians how to bypass the system, and now you have Venezuela. I think you have an economy there now among these countries of autocrats that can now sustain themselves because there's enough there that they don't need to join the world capitalist system, and ultimately that's bad.
Sad kad spominjete taj vrh hranidbenog lanca i ekonomiju, ima li republikanska stranka plan smanjenja američkog deficita i javnog duga, koji zapravo prelaze razinu održivosti?
Listen, I think, I have a minor in economics from college, and what I've learned over the years that you don't cut your way out of deficit, you grow your way out of deficit. So I think the Republicans always had the policy of low tax and low regulation, which ultimately results in your economic growth, which diminishes the size of the debt. Bill Clinton instituted that policy when he was president. He grew, he didn't make any real cuts to the budget, but what he did is he grew the economy at an astronomical rate that the deficit kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, that we ultimately ended up with a balanced budget. The only way the United States is going to deal with the deficit the way it is now is by growing out of it. And so you need those policies that are going to push, 5% GDP, not 2 to 3. Can we? I think Republicans want to institute those policies that sort of unleash the American system where you can have that growth that ultimately diminishes the size of debt, and that'll be a good thing. But Republicans don't control everything in Congress. So, we have to make compromises, which keeps on pushing the debt larger and larger. And, the only way at this particular juncture to get out of the massive debt that we're in is just growth. And it's fast, big growth. It's not going to be 2 to 3% growth. It's going to have to be 5.
Koliko je vama u SAD uopće važno to što se politički, prije smo govorili o nekim aspektima odnosa spram Europske unije, više u svjetlu NATO-a koji sve to prekriva. Ali koliko je vama zapravo zanimljivo to što se danas događa u samoj Europi, primjerice snaženje desnih stranaka, okrupnjavanje zapravo njihove prisutnosti na europskoj sceni, ne samo u pojedinim zemljama i tako dalje, ili predsjednik Trump, to je počelo sa Obamom i njegovom, politikom koja je jasno rekla nećemo više biti svjetski policajac pod svaku cijenu. Ali Obami se pripisuje pak, mislim, nekakav paroksizam izolacionizma, što ja ne mislim, ne dijelim to mišljenje. No je li predsjednik Trump uopće, bude li Trump predsjednik, je li on, i bivši predsjednik Trump, evo da budem korektan, uopće zainteresiran za, znate, taj transatlantski aspekt koji je ovdje nama izuzetno važan. A u nekim državama je bio, mislim, jedna od presudnih komponenti politike. Primjerice Njemačka. Tamo je cijeli niz vodećih ljudi koji su, recimo, Merca su optuživali da je čak previše američki čovjek.
Listen, I think the rise of the far right is a direct result of the failed policies of political leaders here within Europe. You've seen it in the Netherlands. You're now seeing it in Germany with the AfD. The AfD growth is a direct result of the Green Party's leadership in Europe. I mean, it's grown exponentially in the last couple of years, the AfD in Germany, because the policies of the leadership of Germany have sort of ignored the priorities of its citizens, and it's prioritized the refugees and the illegal immigrants that are coming in. So the rise of the far right is a direct reaction of the failures of the policies here of the European Union leaders. And so how do you change that? How do you adapt that? I think you have to sort of have a restructuring of what the priorities are. And you will probably neutralize, the rise of the far right. But I think, trying to dub it far right, trying to dub it extreme, these are people ultimately who, the AfD, they left the CDU for economic reasons. They left the EDU for, refugee reasons because they saw the bad things that were going to happen from just unfettered immigration. And we're several years later, and they proved to be right. So right that even Henry Kissinger, the premier, policy person in the world, acknowledged that Germany has let too many people in and it's had a negative impact, especially since they didn't assimilate. So, the far right is a direct reaction to the failed policies of European leaders. And, who am I to judge whether that's a good thing or a bad thing? Europeans got to figure it out for themselves. But the far right will absolutely have an ally in President Trump because President Trump understands the importance of borders and he understands the importance of the damage that illegal immigration and refugees can have along our border lines.
Mislite li da bi u slučaju Trumpove pobjede mogli gledati iz SAD-a scene kakve smo gledali recimo u Kongresu? Doduše nije to dugo trajalo, ali su bile dosta neugodne te scene. Pogotovo za nas, koji smo, rasli sa slikom i idejom Amerike kao zaista nekakvog svjetlog grada, mislim, primjera uzora demokracije. Koliko god to danas bilo naivno ili ne.
No, listen, I think, listen, the United States, Washington, D.C. is still the shiny city on the hill, as President Reagan said it. We're going through a tough patch because of our politics, but ultimately this is going to just be a small window. Like I said, the reason we are in this very toxic state of politics is because of the reaction that the opposition has had to President Trump. They've stretched the truth, they've stretched the laws, they've stretched policies to target him because they realize the threat that he is. An outsider is not going to restore and secure the institutions in Washington, D.C. An outsider is going to come in and break down those institutions and rebuild it in a way that works. The voters wanted that in 2016. I think it looks like voters want that again in 2024. But, you know, the politics is toxic. And I believe, and whether I'm right or wrong, and history will ultimately prove, the only way we break this fever is by Trump winning his second term, and then him going off into the sunset, and then we can go back to our normal politics, which was less angry. Also, I would recommend that we shut down Twitter and social media because that's adding to the toxicity of our politics. Everything's toxic. I was just in the United States. We have a holiday called Thanksgiving. You know, they used to be very normal. We used to have family together. We could talk about anything. Now we had Thanksgiving. I had people over at my house for Thanksgiving, and all anyone wanted to do was talk about Trump. I wanted to talk about football. So I'm looking for the restoration of the normalness of American politics. I think that returns after President Trump. We see that it probably will, because politicians who've tried to mimic what President Trump has done have not had the same success. So, and that's a good thing, because then that will continue to spread throughout our politics for the next 20 to 40 years. But the fact is that this unique sort of anger is sort of only around President Trump. It gives it a window of when it's over, and that's going to be in 5 years.
Cijelo vrijeme smo govorili o mogućnosti da gospodin Trump postane predsjednik, ali nismo postavili nijedno pitanje o gospodinu Bidenu. Sad na kraju moram biti fair, pa vas pitati, bez obzira što očekujem određeni odgovor, ali zbog naših gledatelja, kako vi vidite mandat predsjednika Bidena i što su vaše temeljne zamjerke?
I mean, I think his mandate in 2020 was not Trump. I think and that sort of gave him a pass. You know, he was able to build this broad coalition of people who were just tired of President Trump and the COVID. You know, there was sort of, and then the election interference that took place. There was a weariness. We wanted to turn the page. But I don't think President Biden came in with a mandate to be this sort of far left liberal that he's become. But he has done some things. He's done some positive things. Listen, I have a 5-year-old son. I don't have to explain to him, you know, the negative things that the president said that day about somebody. He's not asking me anything. So I think what Biden has done to our politics, at least for a short term, he's taken out some of the toxicity, you know, in the first 2 years. It's coming back now, but yeah, listen, we're at a tough point with the toxicity in our politics. I think Biden, for a short window, has done a good job of turning the page. I think also Biden has done a good job of being less chaotic than President Trump. I mean, I remember on Fridays, Friday afternoon was always the most dangerous day of the week because you never knew what President Trump was going to do. On Fridays now, you can relax. So I think those are good things. I think the CHIPS Act was a very good thing that President Biden did. He invested in America. He brought money, you know, back to the United States with respect to, you know, returning manufacturers. There are some things that President Biden did really well. I mean, listen, he's putting money to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. Who am I to say that's a bad thing? That's what President Trump wanted to do. You know, he's kept the policies. You know, he's kept some of President Trump's policies with respect to the 3 C's initiative. So there are good things that President Biden has done. I'm not here to tell you all the bad things. I'm here to tell you that, you know, he's done a good job, but it's coming to an end.
Zapravo, jako uglađeno od vas. Iznenadili ste me ne zbog toga što su republikanci grubi, nego bili ste izuzetno obazrivi i to je lijepo. Good or bad, my country.
We'll see the response at home.
Hvala vam, Bryan, puno što ste bili moj gost. Ja vama, Bryan, jer je to tako nekako uvriježeno u SAD-u, koliko sam vidio da se oslovljava čovjeka u ovakvim intervjuima, bez obzira na razinu prijateljstva poimence. U svakom slučaju, hvala vam što ste bili moj gost ponovo. Nadam se da ćemo se vidjeti i kad se izbori završe, a onda moguće ću zamoliti za neki intervju gospodina Trumpa.
We'll set it up. Thank you again, Romano.
Hvala puno, hvala vam lijepo što ste bili sa nama i vidimo se za štefanje. Doviđenja.